Good morning, everyone. Could you please take your seats? Hi, I'm Susanna Grego. I direct public engagement for the Skoll Foundation. I'm delighted to welcome you all to Democracy in Crisis. I'm not sure I agree with the question mark, but okay. Populism, Polarization, and Civic Engagement. In this session, we'll hear from speakers about the wave of alarmingly popular populist leaders around the world and the faltering of the world's geopolitical stability. But most importantly, maybe, we'll also hear about the surge of political engagement and activism that's happened in response. So what is it that we can learn from these geopolitical shifts to leverage the energy and drive of new and experienced activists everywhere? This session will be moderated by Anne-Marie Slaughter. Anne-Marie is the president and CEO of New America and the professor emerita of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton. Before that, she served as the director of public policy planning for the U.S. Department of State. She was the first woman to hold that position. And before that, there's a lot more, but this is the last thing I'll say. Anne-Marie was the dean of Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs and a professor at Harvard Law School. Having written and edited 7 books and many more articles on connecting in a networked world, the women-men work family puzzle, et cetera, I think she's well on her way to rivaling President Carter in the not-too-distant future. So we couldn't be in more brilliant hands and in for a more provocative discussion. But while I still have the mic, a couple of housekeeping notes. Please, please, please silence your cell phones. But also feel free to share the conversation via social media. The hashtag is #SkollWF. During the Q&A, please wait for the microphone to reach you before speaking. We are live streaming and filming the session. After the session, please take a minute. You have note cards at your seats. Please take a minute to complete the session survey. Thank you and enjoy the conversation.
Thank you. So I am going to follow Skoll Forum rules, and I'm not going to introduce my panel. If I did, it would take us a good 10 minutes. I'm going to let you read in your bios and above us. This is a very timely time to have this conversation. And I want to begin with Sally Osberg's question of Jimmy Carter yesterday. She ended that interview, and I just have to say parenthetically, 32 books. I was completely stunned. I'm certainly not going to reach that. But she ended the interview asking him about American democracy and the strength of American democracy. And he said, you know, he believes the system will hold. We're going to start from that proposition, but put a question mark on it. Is it clear that the system will hold, and not just in the United States? So we're talking about populism, polarization, and then at least one of them, we think, the answers to those problems, civic engagement. But we're not just talking about it in the United States. We're not just talking about it in Western Europe. 2 of our panelists have direct experience of South Africa, Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool, and Turkey, novelist, writer, public commentator, Ece Temokoran. So we're going to look at whether there are patterns globally. We're going to explore the differences between populism and polarization, which are not necessarily the same thing. And then we are going to focus at least half of our time on what to do about it. And we have David Simas, the president of the Obama Foundation, very much engaged in that work. I also have promised, given how many there are of you, that we will try to reserve half our time for questions. So with that, we're going to plunge in. My first question to Ece, is there a global pattern of populism? Many of us, we see it. Indeed, this is week that is devoted to the idea of proximity. We see what is closest to us. So as the two Americans on the panel, we think about populism in the United States, but we also look at Western Europe, we look at Turkey, we look around the world. Is there a global pattern?
The night Trump was elected as president of the United States, some Americans I saw on Twitter saying that, oh, now Turks must be laughing at us. We weren't laughing, but we were smiling sadly, very sadly, because we knew that we were going to watch the same film, this time on a giant screen of United States politics. I do think that there's a global pattern. That's why I'm writing a book about it. How to Lose a Country, The New Ice Age of Politics, due to be published in January 2019 by HarperCollins. But I hope you took notes. The title is very depressing because I do think that people should be depressed a little bit to come to their senses. Leave aside this laughter, this neurotic laughter at Trump or any other populist leader in European countries, and realize that they have to draw lessons from the countries that experience populism, right-wing populism, in fact. I do think that there is a pattern, global pattern, and it's 7 steps. That's why I write the book like a manual for a beginner dictator. I do think that there's a market for it at the moment. It is, I think.
I hope there's 7 steps for how to counter that.
Oh, of course. Otherwise, I wouldn't even dare to say these things. It is create a movement because party is over. Disrupt rationale. Master the particularities of post-truth. Dismantle judiciary apparatus. And design your own citizen, and finally design your own country. These are my 7 easy steps to be a dictator.
All right,
of course,
so
there
go
are
through quickly one
steps.
again. So the first is
create a movement because party's over.
Parties are over. Second,
disrupt the rationale.
Disrupt the rationale.
Yeah, the entire rationale. Actually, attack the reasoning, the basic human reasoning.
Okay.
And discourse as well. There are
challenge
subtitles.
Reason itself.
Yeah.
Right. And third,
master the particularities of post-truth.
Master the particularities of post-truth. Wow. Although it's worth
tempting.
Remembering that the founder of Breitbart in the United States actually learned a lot of his view of truth studying postmodernism in the universities. So, particularities of post-truth.
And then dismantle the judiciary apparatus.
Dismantle the judiciary, yes. That we do see in many countries.
Exactly. And design your own citizen.
Design your own
citizen. And then design your own country.
And design your own country.
At the final stage, you don't need, as a dictator, you don't need any other citizens than your own supporters. That's why Turkey is now experiencing a, not massive, but considerable amount of, exile, self-exile, immigration to European countries and United States.
So when you say design your own citizens, you mean this is what it means to be Turkish, or this is what it means to be American?
And sometimes this is what it means to be a human being.
Okay.
Otherwise, you're the, devil. You're the, unnecessary creature, even.
All right, so that's 7 steps, a manual for a would-be populist leader. I'm going to ask for reactions.
All these steps are very applicable to the countries in Europe, especially, Eastern Europe.
Yes.
And even actually for Brexit at some point, and very much applicable to the United States. Hopefully they will end up better than us.
Okay. Reactions. So, I mean, it's fascinating. The beginning, the idea of challenging the parties and designing a movement, I'm feeling guilty because I often think that the party system in the United States is calcified. Let me just put it that way.
You all want to think that.
But you're right that both on left and right there's a challenge to the party system, and then certainly the disruption and the sort of seizing the narrative. Ibrahim.
No, I agree with AJ that there is a global movement And I think that there are, in a sense, global genes that are being distributed. And the very idea that we come to utilize proximity to overcome it, proximity may have been the cause of the globalization of populism, because we're moving from a world that was monocultural to a world that has become multicultural, even within governments. We're moving from a world where we were very neatly defined as the periphery and the center. Today, we are coexisting. There is no neat divide between periphery and center. The periphery is often in the center at this point. And so the idea that we love the mobility of capital and goods, but don't know what to do with the mobility of people, that is the fundamental challenge that I think has given rise to these populisms. And therefore, you find it in the Muslim world as it is challenged. Media becomes available, old stereotypes can't hold, old traditions can't hold, and so you've got this rise of these recidivist movements that want to re-establish pure Islam. You've got the same thing, make America great again. You've got the thing, let Britain be strong on its own again, let's be Hungarian again, etc., etc., and the rise of the strong personality in Turkey rather than strong institutions. And so I think that we are dealing with a global movement that is multifaceted in appearance, but single in purpose and single in origin. It's part of the distemper of globalization, and therefore this gathering is so important to re-harness the power of proximity and to say it's a power for good, because so far we have ceded it to be a power for bad.
Emery,
You make sense.
on the party piece, as someone who in the former life was the president's political director, part of my job was to deeply understand essentially the structures of the parties and the way power flows through it. One of the things that we saw beginning with the Dean campaign was what the internet did was it began to break one of the fundamental pieces of American party politics, which was money. Up to that point, essentially, you had to go within the system in order to be able to fund. Dean broke that. In 2008, the next piece of that, which was the mobilization of people, the Obama campaign showed that you didn't need to go to the specific interest groups that traditionally formed the backbone of campaigns. You could go directly to people to galvanize. The piece that we saw in 2016, which was the final breaking point, was essentially the control of message completely broke down. So up until that point, imagine a candidate for any office saying, I want to ban a certain group of people from entering the United States. Prior to, let's say, 2012 or 2008, what would have happened would all of the media institutions, both political parties, academia, clergy, essentially all of the parameters of civil society would have said, that's not right or appropriate. The candidate at that moment would not have a way around the gates to basically say, actually, it is appropriate and double down. What we saw in 2016 essentially was with the use of, in this case, social media, but this will not, for me, be a social media bashing session, because Fox, Drudge on the right, cable on the left, essentially now gives you, as a candidate, the venue to say, actually, this is the truth. Norms begin to shift, party apparatus begins to collapse, and all of a sudden you're in a very, very new dynamic where, essentially, voters now, with the exception of, let's say, the 20% on the left who identify as strong Democrats, and will vote accordingly, the 20% on the right who do the same. The vast group of folks in the middle have partisan inclinations, but it's more about identity and less about issues. And so when a candidate comes up and basically can speak directly to them from an identity perspective, it essentially changes the system in a way that destabilizes party, not only in the United States, but I think you're seeing this throughout the planet.
But isn't it playing their game in a way? Aren't you transforming yourself once you start speaking, manipulating the identity concept? using that concept to politicize people?
It's the other way around. Let's look at, for example, a group of people who identify as self-identified Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
For the overwhelming majority of them, just based upon the data, it isn't because of a specific issue or even a set of issues. It's less ideological and it's more effective. I am a member of a team. And so they will shift as soon as there's a signal from whoever the leader of the party is. In some ways, it's less a matter of manipulation. It can be, but it's more a matter of the signaling that's occurring and then the way people follow. Because in some ways, we're not in a polarized world in the United States. We're in an era of negative partisanship. There are as many people who define themselves for either party, not by what their party believes, but because of antipathy towards the other. And motivated reasoning then completely collapses any opportunity to talk about issue or fact in a way that makes people sit back and say, I never thought about it that way. Maybe I was wrong, or maybe I should look at it differently.
So that goes to challenging rationality. Just by the way, whoever's running this clock, it's not running. So I still see that we have 75 minutes. This could be a really long session. We're just going to keep going. But I want. So why is that such a bad thing? I mean, David, as you were talking, I was sitting there thinking, had we not had the 2016 election, I'd have been, yes, break the power of money, break the power of the media in the sense of not being able to get the message out. That is democracy. We need more of it. I hate the fact that if you want to run for office, you have to spend your entire time dialing for dollars. That's the corruption of our democracy. So why do we automatically assume that populism is a bad thing? We've got bad examples, but I would say movements that challenge a corrupt status quo are populist, and why aren't they good?
Can I answer right away? I think it's about the 1%. Populist leaders, they are defending the idea, or they are arguing that they represent the 100% of a country. Whereas, as you said in the opening remarks, the popular movements, popular uprisings, they represent 99%, and they always say it as an Occupy movement. That 1% in between makes the entire change, entire difference between popular and populist, I think. Because in Turkey, in South Africa, or in any other country where populism experienced, the most important argument for oppression is that the popular leader comes up and says, I represent this country, and by time that leader equalizes himself to the state, to the entire population, to the country, etc. So that 1% is important, I think.
So you're saying majority populism would be fine, but minority populism
No, it's not populism. It would be popular, like,
popular rather than populist. Yeah. Ibrahim.
Yeah. If I can mix two metaphors. Before populism...
You can. We may not understand you, but...
Before populism becomes dangerous, it is the canary in the mine. It warns of constrained oxygen, of noxious gases, of something going wrong in the mine. And when it exploits the fear and the uncertainty that comes from that warning, it then becomes the fox in the henhouse. It then feeds off.
The canary becomes the fox. All right.
Absolutely. But the fact of the matter is that I think that the middle ground is complicit in the sense that when it hears the canary warning, when it sees the evidence of its eyes, it becomes technocratic. It becomes boring. It does not respond in ways which I think deal with the sources of discontent, whether it is economic exclusion, social exclusion, identity yearnings, and all of those kind of things, fear, discontent, and anger, and grievance. And it's grievance and discontent that has driven populist movements across the Middle East, for example, based on historical notions of victimhood, based on the continued existence of dictators and authoritarian regimes, the pushback of the Arab Springs, etc., and we ignore the warning signs, and we push ahead with technocratic, interest-based politics, and then we want to wake up and double spend on managing the outcomes of it when the fox has been let loose in the hen house. And that, I think, is the fundamental fault of the middle ground. The middle ground is not the innocent victim. It is a passive perpetrator within the rise of populist movements on the left and on the right. We in South Africa did not understand, for example, the need for haste on land reform, on services to be given to people, on dignity and nipping racism in the bud. And therefore, we reaped a decade of populism where suddenly we found ourselves having to fight a rearguard action to save the purpose of the revolution that Nelson Mandela became the first president of. And so I think we need not a smug politics of distraction. Let's hope Mueller can deal with Trump. Let's hope something comes up from the Russians. It needs a fundamental intellectual, political, and ideological reform, and not the politics of mass distraction that I think is substituting for good oppositional politics in the United States, in Europe, and all over the world.
Exactly. I agree only... Oh, sorry. I agree totally, except for the canary thing. I do think that it's fox from the very beginning, only a small, cute fox. Because as soon as our little fox enters the political sphere, it poisons the political sphere, and it poisons the mind. And then that's why actually I asked David, like, are you sure that, the leader will lead the masses, or the masses will steer the leader to their way of thinking in terms of identity? Because once populism enters the political stage in a country, it starts creating this big effect, something bigger than itself. That's why Nigel Farage, for instance, the leader of UKIP party in Britain, he seems like a funny figure, clownish person, but then he shaped the entire British politics when it comes to Brexit.
But so I heard Ibrahim saying, from the canary point of view, that what happens that you see issues being raised on the extremes before they are completely pernicious, before you have somebody exploiting them. Often a populist leader exploits grievances, but what I heard you saying is they're legitimate grievances that the middle does not address, that the middle says that's the extreme, we don't have to pay attention. Again, in the United States, the example would be trade, where as the mainstream consensus was in favor of free trade, to your point about globalization. Right and left was saying, no, and nobody was really responding.
But see, Anne-Marie, this is a perfect example of actually both sides, the elites on both sides, being completely disconnected from their bases. A majority of Democratic voters in the United States of America are the most pro-trade. The most pro-trade voters in the country are Democrats. The most anti-trade voters in the country are Republicans, and it's been this way since the early 2000s. When you look at the institutions in Washington that both feed the ideas and the funding for both of the parties, our friends on the left in labor are completely anti-trade.
Right.
Our friends on the right in the personages of the Chamber of Commerce and other groups are completely pro-trade. So this creates this jarring asymmetry, essentially, where you look at the voters, either suburban voters or young urban voters who believe in concepts of globalization and what it means for them, who are increasingly the core of the Democratic Party. When you look at former and current union voters in some place in the industrial Midwest who are becoming increasingly the core of the Republican Party, looking to their politicians who are getting signals from others saying, actually, you should vote this way, when their actual voters are thinking something entirely different. It's a complete disconnect, and that issue calls it to question. Now, in terms of one of the most fascinating groups of people for me were the Obama-Trump voters. Mm-hmm. And so a couple of weeks after the election in 2016, we sat down and talked to people who voted for Barack Obama twice, approved of his job performance on election day, and then voted for Donald Trump. And essentially, for this cadre of voters, it made total sense. And there were three things that they focused on that I think, Ibrahim, echoes what you were talking about. First, both of them were complete outsiders. Neither one of them came from the system and the elites that drive the party or Washington. Secondly, neither one of them, interestingly enough, was viewed as particularly partisan. In President Obama's case, the primary in 2008, they saw as him taking on the institutional, partisan, democratic.
And he did. He absolutely did.
And won that insurgency. And in fact, in their minds, he kept that. Trump, the never Trumps, everybody galvanizing until the end, actually was a symbol to them that he wasn't the same old in terms of a partisan actor. The third and most interesting piece for me was hope and change was essentially the other side of the coin for drain the swamp. Because when they heard that, one was in terms of our way to change Washington in the fact that my life isn't getting better no matter how hard I work. And I'm hoping that there is an aspirational way to bring people together around it. And then after 8 years, that morphed into, you know what? Actually, there needs to be a confrontational way to basically make Washington and people think about people like me. And so this is where that sentiment of anger and frustration that life isn't working out the way we said it should be working out manifests itself in our politics, at least in the United States.
Thanks. So I also promised that we're going to talk about what to do about this for half the time we have, because we could spend the entire time on what's wrong. But just to sort of recap, we started by talking about the global pattern of populist leaders who become demagogues. And I think it is important to note that there's nothing wrong with populism per se in the sense of a genuine politics of the people. There's a lot wrong with the exploitation of a popular movement for extreme political ends or anti-democratic ends. So we looked at the patterns, we looked at the role of the middle and what happens then, how you get this surge in terms of responding to what are often very strongly felt reactions to globalization, to technology, to the feeling that your life is not working out as planned, it is beyond your control. And then that fundamental anti-establishment piece that, again, I think you see in democracies or in non-democracies. You can see it in the Arab Spring, you can see it in the color revolutions, and now you can see it in democracies. So with that sort of backdrop, Ej, let me come back to you. Now I want to hear, not necessarily all seven, but I want to hear, what do we do about it? Because presumably you're not just writing a manual for dictators.
Well, you know. A girl has to earn money. You started this panel by talking about faith.
Yes.
And I do think that the most important thing is we have to remember why and when we lost our faith to create a better world, to create better versions of ourselves, and to create a better democracy. I do think that whatever the remedy is to the perils of our time, I think they are somewhere in 1970s. And the cure is remembering those times that we thought of ourselves as capable human beings, as capable political actors, not just audiences watching what's going on in the world and thinking there is no alternative. Because there is no alternative is a sentence that has been imposed on us through 1980s. And now we think that it is our thought, it's our idea that there is no alternative. Now there is an alternative because there is, humanity. There we are thinking. Yes, the party is over. You know, since the collapse of the USSR, you know, the slogan has been popular then, the party is over. And now, the age of political grooves, the age of political elite is over. Whatever the remedy is, it's going to come from the streets. It's going to come from Tahrir, come from Gezi or Spain, all these, you know, agoras that people are trying to build. There is no one answer, but the answer is the collective and collective thinking. Therefore, I think that, you know, all these experiences that accumulated in Tahrir, in Gezi, in Spain, in South Africa even, they have to be articulated now as political experiences. They have to be, you know, they have to create a new political vocabulary. Yes, the answer, sorry, David, but it won't come from parties. It will come from collective thinking on this ground. Although, if parties are courageous enough to connect to these people without changing their discourse, without changing their revolutionary energy, then maybe parties can overcome the populist thinking. But I do think that the first thing we shouldn't do is not to comply with their discourse. We shouldn't call ourselves elite, because that's very dangerous. It's not only Washington elite, you know, that will be disturbed by this narrative, but also my mother, who is a teacher, who is a secular woman, became an elite just because she's not one of them. She's not one of the AKP supporters. So let's be careful about our language, one. And second, let's not forget that we cannot beat this beast with our facts or without scientific, you know, proofs and so on. This is a narrative that we are struggling against, and it's a very good narrative. It's a very good story. Bad man, good man, evil, villain, you know, it's so beautiful. And we are trying to beat this beast with a PowerPoint presentation stick showing numbers. No, we need a story. We need a very good story, and we are actually capable of telling that story, I guess.
So bottom up, you're saying, and a strong counter-narrative, not just complicating the narrative. I want to hear reactions. I'll just say one thing I question, though, is that from the streets, as you say, very good at tearing down, not so good at building up. I mean, one of the lessons of the Arab Spring was you can overthrow a government, but to replace one with a functioning government.
They are very new. They are learning. This party system has been there for hundreds of years.
Fair point.
They're just, you know, a few decades. Give some time.
All right.
And this is the difference between an activist and an organizer. This goes to the heart of the difference. Activism is necessary. It is stray voltage. It is energy. It is noise. Oftentimes it is anger or other types of emotions. It is very easy to then take that and turn it into an us versus them, me against you, given that. Organizing is taking the stray voltage and in a constructive way, directing it towards the power system in a way to bring change. One thing that we're doing at the core of the Obama Foundation's mission of inspiring, empowering, and connecting the next generation of leaders is around deep lessons in civic engagement that have 4 very simple but complicated pieces. One, to the point Aceh just made, when you begin with your personal narrative. Understand that you are not going to persuade people with your set of disjointed facts or PowerPoint. People learn and listen and process in story, and story that is predicated on trust. And the one area in society where there is trust left is proximate. If I know you, or if I know people like you, it is harder for you to become an abstraction or to become the enemy. That is foundational. Step number 2, issue mapping. Once you decide what you care about the most, please understand that it's never binary. Force people to go through root cause analysis. Why? Because it shows you that other people who you disagree with, who care about the same thing, actually may have a good solution. It opens up the aperture of understanding. Don't be binary. Open it up. That's your responsibility in a society. Third, my favorite part, power mapping. Who makes the decisions? But that is the first step of that. Who influences the decision maker? From where does the power derive? Legal, regulatory, normative, society, driven by culture. And then understand fundamentally that that power is temporary, because all politics essentially is a reflection of that moment in time. So understand it and be open to the change. And then the final piece is coalition building, which is where the activist becomes the organizer. How do you build essentially with people that you don't normally agree with, but focus on this one thing that right now you have in common? That creates some muscle memory that's necessary to say, Ibrahim and Aceh and I completely disagree on these four things, but on this one thing, we are aligned in terms of working together. That's the transition from activist to organizer. And the power of this is that if you can remove people from citizenship as simply my rights, which are important, but that too easily devolves into a spectator sport. Someone else will take care of it, and transition it to what are my responsibilities. And I don't mean voting. Voting is the minimum entry to civic engagement and citizenship. All of a sudden, you can begin to reconstruct a movement on the street that isn't just about the noise, but it's about reconstructing a sense of civic and civil society where we come together. Those are the ways, I think, that we can begin to answer that challenge. Imran.
So, Ibrahim, I want to hear you. I mean, to me, that sounds like a politics manual. In other words, that's how politics works. You figure out stories, you map your issue, you map the power, you build the coalition, you organize it. But I think in many of these countries, or I'll just speak for my own, or actually a French public intellectual I heard recently talking about France, people don't believe politics works anymore. That politics itself, that sense that there's some connection between what I as citizen do and what actually happens is broken. So,
and I'm glad you raised this. This is, viewing it through politics is completely limiting. Because most of the time where we see in a community, let's focus on the south side of Chicago. If I can bring 10 or 15 groups together to work around cleaning up a park right now that is infected with both violence and with drug use, all of a sudden you are creating, independent of who I vote for or which alderman is connected to whom, you are building a sense of community in a way that in many places no longer exists. That is a necessary precondition to begin to put things together.
Also, you are reminding people that politics is beyond party politics, and
Exactly
it is
right.
in your life, in your daily life, and it's about who you are, which is the necessary thing to revive the, faith in politics, I think.
But when you ask that question, I wonder what made South Africa survive and start the revival against the populist decade that we've just emerged from. And it was the fact that our values and our purpose and everything, our freedom, democracy, and human rights were constitutionally founded. I once accused a late judge in the Supreme Court of reading through originalism the American Constitution in the same way that Osama bin Laden reads the Quran. Literally, without alteration, originally, and stuck in a particular century. So Americans need not to ditch their Constitution, and all of us, but to utilize its founding precepts and do battle for its meaning. And if necessary, follow Thomas Jefferson's advice, change it every 19 years to catch up with what society wants.
reinterpret.
Secondly, what we need, what made us survive was that our values were embedded in our institutions. We had an activist judiciary, not an elected one by a president, but one by a neutral body that puts the best minds there. Secondly, we had an investigative journalism. And third, not a chasing the next breaking news one, but going deep and finding stuff. Mm-hmm. And then the third one was, it was protected societally. that, and this is where we mustn't make a binary of parliamentary politics and extra-parliamentary politics, because in our case, the energy outside of Parliament gave courage to Parliament to put the president to terms. And so if we are able to do those kind of things, we begin to really get a move forward. I think we can take the role of local organization, but if it's not connected to a bigger national project and a global project, it leads to fragmentation. If we only at the global level, we have jamborees, but no action and no change on the ground. So how do we balance those kind of imperatives so that even the one fighting drugs in Chicago's South Side is part of a global movement for equity, gender equity, class equity, racial justice in the world today. And we've got to find the connection of the various dots that I think we have. I think what we need is recognize and organize the discontent. Don't let it be organized under our noses. If we can't do that, what it will morph into is victimhood. Victimhood that's based on anger and discontent, and what we need to do as the middle ground is to give it a name, put it in a set of demands, work for it in various ways, in Parliament, outside Parliament, and be able to turn it into agency, one that has purpose and one that has a program. Without those things, we don't succeed in doing anything. The third thing we do, David's point, is build partnerships. I work with Muslim leadership in the USA, in the minority communities of France and Belgium, in North Africa, the Arab Spring people, and so forth. And the most important thing that I need to teach them is proximity. How do you build partnerships with others? I tell them the difference between an alliance. You enter into alliances with those who share your values. And if you find those people, work with them. But if you don't find a sharing of values and lifestyle, and you find certain aspects abominable in your own mind, then go for coalitions, because you may share objectives. And if you even don't share objectives with them, then go for quick partnerships, because you may share issues and projects. Now, if we don't break it down like that, a Muslim will never be in the same coalition with a gay in the United States, but both of them have problems with Trump. Black Lives Matter may become so exclusive that they think that making coalitions with brown lives is a watering down of their purpose. How do we show them? You see, these are practical stuff that we need to do. And then I end by saying that we must find the middle ground between, for example, a Mahatma Gandhi and passive resistance, which is absolutely crucial, and a Malcolm X, by all means necessary. I think that Nelson Mandela embodied for us the notion of militant nonviolence. The middle ground can't be boring when we are fighting for our survival. The middle ground can't be disarmed when we need to give people who feel the brunt of injustice some way of mitigating that injustice through militant nonviolence. And we need to understand whether all of these marches and these petitions and so forth are going anywhere, or is part of what we need to do to test the governability of the populists. And those are some of the things that I think we really need to be engaging in as we go forward. Otherwise, we will simply be at the mercy of competing populisms. One on the margins, extreme in the deserts of Syria, in the mountains of Afghanistan. The other sitting in the White House, sitting in Parliament, sitting in the governing seats of Hungary, and all of those kind of things. Those are the competing populisms. We are in between, and we need to mobilize and find the answers. Otherwise, democracy in crisis will not be a question mark. Because sometimes we trade, and I said it was the last thing, but I'm
It's got to be the last thing.
It's got to be the last
Yes.
thing. Otherwise, we, through our daily actions, when we give in our voice to earn the label patriot, when we we cede our liberty in order to get security, when we give up our freedom in order to feel safer, that is the Faustian pact we make with populists every single day.
Thank you. So we have 25 minutes for audience questions. I promised I would leave as much time as I could. In this conversation, there are a number of common themes about what to do, starting very much with restoring the idea of human agency, connecting it to purpose, connecting it to a local purpose, but also a national or a global purpose. That's part of how we inspire people with meaning. Civic engagement, so not just around connecting people to the idea of voting, but connecting people to a larger idea of what politics is. So it's not just voting, it's not just parties, it's getting things done. And you can do that through government, but you can also do that actually by simply bringing people together in organized ways with institutions. So I think that sort of bottom-up sense. The other thing that you all referenced, which is really at the heart of classic theories of democracy, are cross-cutting cleavages, right? The idea, this is Robert Dahl, this is the most of us in our initial classes on politics, that you're not going to agree with everybody on anything, but you can agree with others whom I may be with someone who I really disagree with around reproductive rights or gun rights, but who I absolutely agree with on the need to take back our community or to get rid of money in politics. And that idea of cross-cutting cleavages is what weaves a fabric of a resilient democracy. So I've got one last question that I'm going to hold to the end, come back to this question of faith. But for now, let me open it to the audience. It's hard for me to see you, so you need to... Oh, okay, this way.
That helps.
Yes, so there's a question over there. Wait for the microphone and so that everybody can hear you. And please, if you can, direct your questions so we don't have one question and three answers. That way, we'll have more time for questions.
Thank you. Thanks for your comments. My question is around the solution piece of this and civic engagement. I didn't hear education or youth engagement come up. And I'm curious, I know a bit about Turkey's education system, very centralized, US, very decentralized. But to be frank, you're developing your worldview not when you're 40, right? This is something that's evolving, and the narrative that you're receiving and the way you learn to think critically or create networks and connections and collaboration starts much earlier. So can any of you on the panel speak to that specifically as a pathway and maybe directly around what needs to happen there?
So at least from our perspective, let me give you a perfect example. The Parkland students in Florida, there are the perfect example of civic engagement from an organizer's mentality. The thing that's most striking to me that people don't talk about very much is the state of Florida just recently introduced a civics curriculum. Oh. And when you watch those young people on TV, they are reciting chapter and verse of what they learned in the classroom. And so for them, the move from individual agency to collective action is actually predicated on something that maybe a year ago or a couple of weeks ago before the tragedy occurred, they were hearing. And so in their minds, they simply weren't a public school student who were the recipients of all of these benefits, who had these rights that they had to protect. They were actors. And this moment called for it. So when we think about what we want to build, both domestically and then eventually globally, there will be a piece about civics education and action learning that has to be embedded, because if the Obama Foundation is only touching people on college campuses, it's not too late, but essentially the opportunity costs there are massive. So thank you for that question. It's important to add to this discussion.
There in the center, Amy.
Hi, Amy Lowe. This is also for David Siemens. I'm curious if you could reflect a bit on the conversation happening now in the U.S. around impeachment. In some ways, I think it represents the ultimate corrective in democracy if it's owned by the people, but I can appreciate for the Obama, Trump voters, it may be the ultimate sign of an elite power grab, and could it have drastic and profound unintended consequences downstream? And what would you advise for the impeachment folks that are pushing this conversation?
So fortunately, I am, as it relates to political advisement, I am retired. However, let me speak based upon what I remember. Although that's becoming increasingly difficult. There was a moment in 2012 or 13 where the cries for impeachment from our Republican friends towards President Obama for the scandals that we were going through, not including wearing the tan suit, which seems fairly quaint right now, were increasing. One of the things that I had the great pleasure of doing was I would listen to focus groups every couple of weeks throughout the country. And we would listen to essentially voters in the middle of the electorate, voters who voted for Democrats and Republicans in primaries. So it wasn't just what they were saying. We knew that they would vote both ways. The one thing that would move them quickly into the Obama camp, no matter how angry they were at the president or disappointed more often than not, was when they heard talk of impeachment. As soon as they heard that talk, it immediately took the discussion out of policy or issues into what they saw as blue team versus red team, constant struggle for power. At that time, the discussion wasn't tethered in constitutional crises or challenges, but that was the first reaction. Here's a second example. Scott Walker in Wisconsin was subject to a recall. And the reaction in voters in Wisconsin who disagreed with the recall vote that was occurring weren't that all of a sudden they approved of the job that he was doing, but essentially what they said is, look, we just had an election. We're going to have another election soon. To the extent that I disagree with him, I will take it up at the next election. This is what the system is for. So the tension here, right, is between essentially the way people are going to be processing this discussion. Based on what I have seen, immediately people put it in a blue team versus red team dynamic and move away from the underlying subject of whatever the issue is that's triggering the discussion. Motivated reasoning in a political environment in the United States is powerful. And what I mean by that is when you introduce a fact or an issue to a voter who identifies either as a Democrat or Republican that is contrary to the interests of their identity, against their party, you will see that voter essentially discount the fact that's been introduced in a variety of different ways. In 2016, we heard relative to candidate Trump, President Trump now, that any time a fact was introduced by the media or by the Clinton campaign, here's the level of motivated reasoning that occurred. First, he didn't mean it. Second, he's being taken out of context. Third, he's a master negotiator. He said it only for effect. Fourth, he's a master entertainer. He's saying it only for effect to get more coverage. Or fifth, yes, what he said was terrible, but she's worse.
It's reading.
And so essentially that gives you a little bit of how I have seen this play out in the past with a little bit of foreshadowing as to how I think it would play out in the future.
It goes.
Just a quick riposte to it. I think the opportunity of impeachment is that it can short-circuit a nightmare. The danger of impeachment is that the Democrats abdicate their introspection to Mueller and to Russia. And the middle ground is demobilized into spectators of a pageantry that is playing out at high level and are not doing what should be done to reform the society. I really think let impeachment process go on, but don't let it be the substitute for substantive action and reflection and remaking of opposition parties. That will be the danger.
Where is it? Down here. I'm trying to see everybody here. Okay, I see you down.
Hi. I just want to ask if any of you are paying attention against the crime of our democracy in Brazil that starts with the impeachment of Dilma and now the Lula that is in prison because of a PowerPoint and evidence, and they don't have a single proof, and also the crime against the city council, Marielle, that was executed in the streets of Rio because she was an activist.
Does anyone want to?
Well, I recently spoke to a friend who is living in Brazil and who's quite active, politically active. And I asked about, what's going on, what's happening to Lula, and, is this populist using this impeachment process as a political tool as well? And now he's in prison. And I had, he had this gesture that we do a lot in Turkey. It's complicated gesture, it's so complicated. And he said, yeah, he is guilty, but he's not the worst one. So in this, in this messy political situation, we always go through this interesting judiciary processes where people are prosecuted not for the reason that we want them to be prosecuted. So it is really messy, and this is all I could say. I'm not an expert on Brazil politics. Although, about impeachment, I have to say something. In the early stages of this rising populism, there is always this mind shelters, let's say, that people want to depend on. And I do think that impeachment is one of them. People have this virtual comfort there when they think about impeachment, although impeachment is a very, very far-fetched legal and political tool, and probably it won't happen, I'm sorry. And then as soon as impeachment is gone, I think that we were talking about this with David earlier, it's going to be midterm elections. And when midterm elections is gone, and I hope it won't, it will be in favor of Democrats, but when it's over, it will be another thing. So be careful about this mind shelters, I would say, as an experienced citizen.
And I would say your question very much builds on the dangers of using impeachment too readily, because indeed from the outside, you saw, everybody could impeach everybody else, or at least try. And once that happens, that is the destruction of democracy, but at the top, using the state. Thank you for that question. I'm trying to look there in the back. There's a gentleman in the back. There's a gentleman in the far back. All right, in the far back, and then I'm going to come back down to this gentleman in the middle back.
Thank you very much. Listening to some of the prescriptions in terms of how we deal with this crisis, it seems to me that it's based on the assumption that people are able to organise and that people are given voice, and there is an independent civil society that is able to.
I'm sorry. Hang on. Are you standing up? I'm sorry.
I know. Should I stand up?
Yes.
So I was saying, listening to some of the prescriptions, so they seem to be predicated on an idea that there is an independent civil society, that people have got a voice, people are able to organise politically. And yet what we know about a lot of these populists, taking examples from Turkey, for example, is that they try and shut down independent associations, they try and limit people from engaging politically, and they try and cut the legs out from opposition political parties. So in that sense, I struggle to understand in places like the Philippines, for example, or elsewhere in Turkey, how some of these recommendations are going to work. So I'd be interested to know what your recommendations were for how we push back on this closing space and the growing crackdown on independent NGOs and civil society globally.
So how do you fight back?
Well, do you remember the time when Trump spoke about Meryl Streep and he said she's overrated? I thought, he already started doing that, taking down, discrediting the intellectuals. Before they go to NGOs, they discredit the intellectuals, they ridicule the intellectuals, which leaves a society without the lighthouses, so to speak, without the capacity of articulating the demands. Therefore, I would say that my first recommendation would be careful with your intellectuals. And if you want to tease them or mock them, do it, inside the circle. Don't give ammunition to the populist leader to ridicule them even more. And then once the society is, loses its respect to intellectual debate, and then it goes to NGOs, to the streets, and they start harassing the NGOs and the leaders of the NGOs. And they are now not trying to oppress the NGOs, but NGOs are almost totally paralyzed in Turkey. That's why it's the democracy is equal to ballot boxes now, and is also limited to ballot boxes and voting process. So, and NGOs, I think, should be more in touch with those political movements that have been active in Gezi and Tahrir, and also they shouldn't be afraid of doing politics and being in touch with party politics. Throughout 80s and 90s, the politics somehow became unsexy. Now it's sexy again, so NGOs should be far more politicized than they were in last decade. I think, everybody will be politicized, especially the citizens, that consider themselves as voting normal, people. They will become militant citizens, and NGOs would be benefiting from this, politicization that is triggered by the populist leaders, I hope.
But what do you do now? I mean, I heard the question as as in Turkey, as in Brazil, as in a number of, or the Philippines, once a populist is in power and has systematically weakened the bulwarks of democracy, what do you do? I heard the question is, if society really feels like it has no agency, where do you start? How do you push back?
You see, I think in the case that you mentioned in the US, the populist has also set the terms of the engagement. He tweets, everyone else retweets. And I think that the middle ground's reliance on remote activism, you can like on Facebook and you can maybe mobilize and get them into a place, but that doesn't mean equality of organization. You can retweet, but it doesn't by itself mean a quality of organization. I look at the way we were prepared in South Africa and what the civil rights leaders, how they prepared for being battened, how they prepared for tear gas, how they prepared for this. And so every movement needs, we must say that activism is a contact sport. We need contact. We need to have a core of people that understand the purpose, are committed to the path, and that can be a wonderful infectious disease if we believe that some things are worth fighting for. And so I believe that education is absolutely critical, because the best remedy to the anti-intellectualism of populism is intellectualism. And whether you agree with artists and poets or whatever the case may be, the very activity that they do makes us think and makes us question and interrogate. And so we need that. But we also need training for being able to take our democracy back. What do we say? And therefore, Facebook and Twitter and social media is a wonderful way to spread the message, but it is not the substitute for activism as a contact sport. And we've got to prepare the cause of people who are currently in universities, who feel it the most, the affected people, before they become embedded in victimhood. How do we turn them into agents? And so we need to be able to do those kind of things. The kind of day-to-day organizing that David speaks about should be replicated in every locality.
And at some point, the courage to take a bullet. I mean, because that's part of what you're talking about.
And to the question, especially, and obviously there are many that do this well, and there are others who don't do it well. One of the principles of organizing, and it applies at whatever level, is you do not go into the church hall as the organizer and begin by telling people what you think they need. Because one thing that the populace completely understands, and understands very well, is that sense of what the people are feeling. Because in some ways they're telling you And the challenge then is to then take that sentiment and direct it either in a way that builds community or enhances a sense of tribalism. So, in places where those avenues are closed off, the opportunity there to engage in those elements of society where you are totally listening to what people are feeling and to structure what you are doing around those sentiments rather than the other way around is the first step. The second step is, in each one of these communities, there are ambitious young people who have something that no NGO has: trust. Nurture, cultivate, build, empower, and then connect her with someone else in the community next door. This is the way that we begin to bridge that very local to national. And that's why this isn't an isolated activity. It's part of a broader network. The beauty of social media and social networks is that it now gives us the ability to take those disparate individuals in 10,000 communities and obviously ladder them up to something much, much bigger around shared values that are reflecting the sentiment that the people are feeling in a real sense. But look, in the United States, given our ability to do that and organize, I'm very, very mindful of the challenges that other people face. So I don't want to be Pollyannish.
We have time for one last question. I was looking at the, I'm sorry. There in the, yep.
No.
Hi, thanks so much for this. Just to this point about proximity as being a cause for this and then also potentially a solution, and the discussion about partnerships and coalition building, the geographic polarization in the US, blue states versus red states, people not even knowing Trump voters or vice versa. How do we address that and really harness proximity as a solution for this?
So I did not actually plant her to return to the theme of the week on the power of proximity, but it is a great last question, and I apologize to those of you who couldn't ask questions. You can come up after. As you answer that, and I'm going to go down the row this way, I also am going to ask my last question. So we're talking about the power of proximity, but I also want you to reflect on, is it better to have faith that the system will hold, or to fear that it won't? Because yesterday we heard again Jimmy Carter saying, it's going to hold, and here's my book, and it's faith. And indeed, faith is a belief in things unseen, and in many ways the working of a democracy is that. It's things that are seen, but it's also norms, rules, ways, belief that we can come together. But too much faith can breed complacency, which Ibrahim has also been saying. So talk about the power of proximity and just reflect for a minute on faith and fear.
I think that as a middle ground, we should not fear difference, but we should prevent it from becoming divisions. We should not fear diversity, but we should prevent it from becoming conflict. And sometimes I think we have an overweening fear of anything that is different, and therefore the blue and the red are forever separated. Men and women will never find a gender equity. Muslim and gays will never sit in the same organization, and so forth. And we fossilize and we concretize what are differences amongst people. And therefore, we've got to find ways to overcome all of those kind of things. And maybe it's not the impeachment issue. Maybe, for example, in the US, it is the shared idea that we are all losers when there's a trade war. And therefore, so we've got to find the issues that almost transgress the natural divides. And that's the power of leadership in activism. And that's when a factory worker in Michigan and a farmer in Ohio may find common cause if we bring them in proximity to each other. I think we've gone worse than having faith that we will survive all of this. We've made it a religion. Spirituality is when you feel uncomfortable in your soul about something and you feel moved to do something about it. Faith tells you these are the strategic ways that we've had before. If we just continue to vote and if we just continue turn out for elections and so forth, the system will correct itself. There's a complacency inherent in that, but a religious fervor to believe that makes us all non-actors in our own pageant. And so really I would go so far as to say, with great respect to President Carter's belief, when someone of his stature says it's going to be all right, someone of our stature may say, oh, thank God, I don't have to go to the next march. And so therefore, I would urge us, faith is not just a belief, as I believe in Islam, but always the Quran speaks about those who believe and do good. Unless the two are coupled, there is no paradise for you.
Thanks. David.
So on the question of proximity, one of the, I've talked about a couple of pieces of our training program. Very quickly, I'm going to touch on one piece that goes directly to this. So on the first night of the Obama summit last year, we had something called the Community Supper. And the Community Supper was where we basically sat around a table and people who did disagree with each other left their resumes at the door and began to talk about their family, their communities, their why, their values. When you can do that with people that you disagree with fundamentally on political issues, and you can see them through the eyes of either their parents or their children or as a neighbor, it begins to break it down. That's the first piece. The second piece of the training that speaks to this, there's a group called Narrative 4, and I urge everybody to look up this group. They have this training exercise where essentially you have to sit knee to knee with someone else. You give them your personal story. They give you their personal story. You then stand up in front of the room and give their personal story in the first person. It is the most powerful exchange of empathy I have ever seen. Here was the example. At the Obama summit, a young man from the south side of Chicago exchanged his personal story with a young woman from Aleppo, Syria. When she stood up and testified to the life of the young man from Chicago, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. When he stood up and testified to the young woman from Aleppo, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The power there wasn't just the poignancy of their stories. The power was that these two people from completely different places had this moment of deep human and empathetic connection that transcended everything. All of us have that capacity. And so rather than beginning by casting judgment on, I can't even understand how you could possibly vote for someone like that, or my favorite, how could they vote against their self-interest? Stop that. We have no idea what their self-interest is, or their worldview, or where they come from, or what they're suffering through. Listen first. Connect. That's the power of proximity. And then to the question of faith, there's an old line by an old boss of mine. His name is Deval Patrick. He's a former governor of the great Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Go Red Sox.
Red Sox Nation.
Can't help myself. Deval Patrick, like another boss of mine, would talk about hope. But he would always temper it by saying, hope for the best and work for it. Because without the latter piece, then the first piece doesn't mean anything.
Thank you. Eche, you have the last word.
It is interesting to listen all these statements because proximity and listen first, that statement is actually, I saw it like more than a decade ago in Subcomandante Marcos's articles. So we are actually getting, bit by bit to left here, which is good. About faith, I'm not like Ibrahim. I don't see the God as source of faith. Unfortunately, I believe in humanity actually. So even though the humans refute my faith in them, I keep believing in humanity. So faith is not a blind belief, but it's a moral duty for me. Moral, ideological, and spiritual duty for me to believe in human beings. Therefore, I do believe in human beings, and I do think that the only way for them to overcome the perils of our time is to believe in themselves and to remember that their brain is actually, their brain, if they think that there is no alternative, is shaped by the recent times. It is not the fact. It is a lie that there is no alternative. There is an alternative, but the first thing is to believe in humanity and human beings, I guess.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.